I'm Jeremy Scahill from Dropsite News, dropsitenews.com. At this moment, Steve Witkoff and other U.S. negotiators are currently in Doha, Qatar for a round of negotiations on the so-called ceasefire deal between Hamas and Israel. It's also a deal for the exchange of further captives, both those being held inside of the Gaza Strip, as well as some of the thousands of Palestinians that remain in Israeli jails, prisons, and other facilities. And it's important to remind people that since October 7th, 2023, Israel has intentionally taken hundreds, by some estimates, more than 1,000 Palestinians hostage just for the purpose of using them for exchange to try to get more Israeli captives released. And these talks that are happening right now in Doha come in the midst of the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. There already were severe food shortages inside of Gaza. When the ceasefire agreement was originally implemented on January 19th, Israel started to allow some aid back into Gaza, but they never were delivering the agreed upon quantities of aid under the terms of the agreement. They also refused to deliver almost any of the 60,000 mobile homes that were supposed to enter the Gaza Strip. They only allowed the entry of a fraction of the 200,000 tents that were supposed to come into Gaza. But during that period, those 42 days, there was aid coming into the Gaza Strip. And what was supposed to happen under the terms of this agreement that Israel signed up for was that there was supposed to be discussions starting on February 3rd to discuss the implementation of what's known as the second phase of this agreement. Israel refused to ever send negotiators to begin those talks. Instead, Benjamin Netanyahu went to Washington, where he became the first foreign leader to meet with the newly reelected Donald Trump. And of course, that was where Trump made his famous threat that the United States was going to seize the Gaza Strip and turn it into what Trump called a Middle East Riviera. So what has happened since that White House meeting is that Netanyahu has engaged in a campaign that has been going on from the beginning to try to sabotage any actual mediated agreement and assert that Israel retains the right to continue its full-scale war against Gaza. And in the past 12 days or so, since phase one of that deal ended, Netanyahu has put forward a new set of demands that were not covered under the original agreement. And Netanyahu, remember, claims that he had a side letter, not just from Donald Trump, saying that Israel could essentially resume the full-scale war if it decided that the ceasefire negotiations were not proceeding in a way that was acceptable to Israel, but also said that he had a side letter from former President Biden. Remember, this deal officially happened while Biden was president, but we all know that it wouldn't have happened had Trump not intervened after he won the 2024 presidential election. Well, what has happened now is that for the past more than a week, Israel has implemented a full blockade around the Gaza Strip and is allowing no aid in, and then recently cut off electricity to the last remaining desalination plant in Gaza. That's in Deir al-Balah. This was a source of drinking water for an estimated 500,000 Palestinians. So the situation inside of Gaza remains incredibly dire. It happens also at the same time when Israel is engaged in one of the largest, if not the largest, campaign of ethnic cleansing in the West Bank since 1967. Tens of thousands of Palestinians being violently forced from their homes, people being snatched and taken into Israeli custody, others being killed. The stakes are very, very high right now. Hamas, which did engage, we learned recently, in direct talks with U.S. officials, is saying that they are open to a deal, that they are operating in good faith. They are saying that even though Israel has reneged on its signed agreements, that they come into this negotiation with an open mind. What Israel has put on the table, according to Israeli media reports, is what amounts to a temporary extension of the first phase of the ceasefire deal, where Israel would not have to comply with any of what it signed up for in phase two, which is a full withdrawal from Gaza, and then a meaningful and lasting truce, an end to its full-scale war against Gaza that would then lead to full-scale reconstruction operations in the Gaza Strip. There is a lot to talk about, and we're very honored to have a well-informed guest who is following these developments as close as anyone. It's Dr. Sami Al-Arian. He joins us from Istanbul. He's the director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul's Zaim University. Originally from Palestine, Dr. Al-Arian lived for some 4 decades in the United States, and some of our viewers and listeners may be familiar with his case because under George W. Bush's administration, Dr. Sami Al-Arian was prosecuted and persecuted under the USA Patriot Act, and he was put on trial on 53 counts. They were accusing him of being the North American head of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. That case went to trial, and Dr. Sami Al-Arian was never actually convicted by a jury of any of these charges, but the case went on and on and on. They then tried to railroad him in an unrelated case, and eventually, even though Dr. Al-Arian wanted to, by his own account, continue fighting because he said he had nothing to hide, he eventually agreed as part of a deal with the government that he would leave the United States. We are monitoring very closely the situation of Mahmoud Khalil, the Columbia University graduate who is a legal permanent resident of the United States. He's a green card holder. He's married to an American citizen. His wife is 8 months pregnant. Last weekend, he was snatched from his Columbia University housing and for a period was disappeared. He was supposedly in New Jersey being held at an ICE facility. His wife goes there to try to see him. They say he's not there. The lawyer tries to see him. He's not there. And then we learn that he's been shipped down to the south of the United States and being held in Louisiana. His fate is very much up in the air right now. And at the heart of it is not just this one man, but is the very existence of the concepts of due process and First Amendment rights in the United States. So there's a lot to talk about with Dr. Al-Arian about both the ceasefire negotiations and this snatching of Mahmoud Khalil and an attempt to deport him despite the fact that he's a legal permanent resident exercising his First Amendment rights. Dr. Sami Al-Arian, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So, Sami, let's start with what's happening right now in Doha. We know that Netanyahu has presented his own proposal for what he wants to see happen right now to try to get as many of the Israeli and dual national captives out of the Gaza Strip without giving the other side any of what Israel agreed to in the original framework. Talk for a moment about what you understand to be the strategy or the perspective of the Palestinian negotiators in Doha right now, how they see this.
Right. Well, let's remember that the agreement that was signed went into effect on January 19th was a product of months and months of negotiations. The original agreement was proposed by the former President Biden, and he said it was an Israeli proposal, in which Hamas gave its agreement at the end of May and then reconfirmed it in early July. Yet the Israeli government did not accept it. They rejected it, and they kept stalling for the entire summer and fall until Trump was elected president. And then with the pressure, I guess, from the envoy, from Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, they agreed to the terms. And the terms were very, very clear. It's going to be a 3-stage ceasefire in which every stage would be around 42 days or about 6 weeks. In the first stage, there will be certain things that each party would adhere to, and that it will be monitored and guaranteed by 3 parties, namely Egypt, Qatar, and the United States. Hamas has fulfilled its obligation, which was basically to release 33 of the captives, of the Israeli captives, including, of course, some were dead and some were alive. And with that, the Israelis were supposed also to fulfill their obligations. And some of these obligations had to do with withdrawal, Israel had to withdraw from certain areas in Gaza within certain perimeters of the periphery of Gaza. They needed also to allow for aid and for aid to come in particularly to northern Gaza as well as the rest of Gaza, around 600 trucks a day, including 50 trucks of fuel. They were supposed to allow the injured to leave the Rafah crossing to Egypt so that they can get treatment. They were supposed to allow about 60,000 caravans as well as 200,000 tents for the people of Gaza, because about 90 to 95% of Gaza has been totally destroyed, including many residences, the majority of them. They were also supposed to allow the basic services to be conducted, and as well as people from Palestine to go back to North Gaza by dismantling the Netzarim crossing. All these things, most of these things, including the aid, including the withdrawal, including the injured, were never fulfilled by Israel. Israel did not do any of these. In addition, the agreement that it was signed by all the parties, Israel, the Hamas, as well as the mediators, they were supposed to start the second phase negotiations on day 16, as you pointed out. That was never done. That had never taken place. And they were supposed also to withdraw on day 42 from the Philadelphia corridor at the border between Egypt and Israel, and to complete that withdrawal in day 50, which was last Sunday before last, and also that didn't take place. So none of the obligations that the Israelis have signed on to, have signed up for, they were fulfilled. And the position of Hamas and the other resistance movement is that we're not going to negotiate what has already been negotiated and signed. That is going to be a really bad precedent, because what it says is that whatever we negotiate and spend months and months and months, including give and take on both sides, it doesn't mean anything, because Israel is going to come back and try to renegotiate what they didn't like and get what they liked, which is basically get back the captives. Meanwhile, when Israel was violating all these terms of the agreement, Steve Witkoff came with a proposal. He said it was his proposal, but obviously it was a negotiated position between him and the person who was appointed by Netanyahu to lead these negotiations, who is an American Israeli by the name of Ron Drimmer. He came with this idea that we needed to release whatever the remainder of the hostages, of the captives are, half of them upfront, and then the other half after the negotiations of the second phase. And actually, he didn't say second phase. He said we need to extend, to make an extension of the first phase. In other words, they want to change the agreement. They want to scuttle it. They want to just get it go away, because they got what they wanted from the first stage without fulfilling their obligations. The position of the resistance is that's not going to happen. We're not going to agree to re-litigate, to renegotiate what has already been negotiated. Israel has to fulfill its part. When this was taking place, one of the American negotiators who's in charge of the release of the captives was going back and forth in Qatar and opened a channel with Hamas. This is probably the first time that the American government says publicly that they have met with Hamas, even though they've met in the past, but they never acknowledged that. So this is the first time they acknowledge that there has been a meeting between an American official and Hamas, and that took place in Qatar at 4 different occasions, but it only centered on the remaining of the American hostages. Keep in mind that the price for the hostages differs from the first stage to the second stage. The reason they did it in 2 stages is because the price of the people who would be released on the Palestinian side, there are thousands and thousands of Palestinians who are also prisoners in Israeli prison. A lot of them, as you pointed out, have been taken during the Gaza genocide. Some have been taken before. Hundreds were taken under what's called administrative detention without any charges, and others who have been sentenced to very long sentences, including life sentences. About 600 of them were sentences. And part of this was to release these prisoners who have been suffering tremendously, particularly under this current regime, in which they have been tortured, they have been subjected to starvation, even rape and other things. most of the privileges given or that they have gained throughout decades in prison have been taken away by the person who was in charge of this prison system, which was being clear before he resigned recently. At any rate, the price for the civilians who were released in the first stage was different from the price of the soldiers. The people who are left now, about 60 or 59, between 59 and 66, most likely 59, about half dead, half alive, is different. And there are only one American who's alive and 4 bodies. And what Adam Boehler was trying to do is to get a separate negotiation, because I guess the administration has given up on Netanyahu, because they know he's playing games. So they wanted to do a separate deal, and they started talking about the details. What will be the price of this person? Because this person was a soldier. He was a fighter. He wasn't just a civilian that was taken and abducted while he's having a tourist journey or something in Israel. He was actually fighting in Gaza and fighting with the Israeli army, and he was taken as prisoner of war, and therefore the price would be different. The details were also negotiated, but I guess it never came through because maybe Israel did not agree to the release of the prisoners. We never really know why they didn't pan out, why they didn't finish.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting. You mentioned Adam Boehler there, who is the U.S. Special Envoy on hostages. He appeared on several, not just American news shows, but also on Israeli shows, and he made remarks that really infuriated the Israelis. And the same has been true of Steve Witkoff, you know, Trump's friend, who also is a billionaire real estate guy. And what I've heard from Palestinian sources is they don't have any illusions, you know, about Steve Witkoff or Adam Boehler. They know these guys are, you know, unrepentant supporters of Israel and all of its policies. But there's a sense that they're actually talking straight. That when they would deal with, you know, with Antony Blinken or with people from the Biden administration, that they never quite knew what was true or what wasn't true. So there's an interesting dynamic here. It's not that I don't think any Palestinians view Donald Trump as the great hope, you know, for Gaza or the West Bank. But you're talking about a micro situation here. And, you know, it does seem as though Hamas feels that at least they're dealing with people that are saying what they mean. And I want to just read you a quote here. When Adam Boehler was on CNN, he mentioned Ron Dermer because Jake Tapper brought up that the Israelis were irritated about this. And he said, quote, "I spoke with Ron and I'm sympathetic. He has someone that he doesn't know well, making direct contact with Hamas. Maybe I would see them and say, quote, look, they don't have horns growing out of their head. They're actually guys like us. They're pretty nice guys." Then he goes on and he says, Israel knows walking out of that it's not like Hamas got the world because I thought they were a bunch of nice guys. Now, you know, Boehler then has to walk all of that back, and he puts things on Twitter and says, you know, these guys are, you know, murderous terrorists. And of course, they're by default bad people. But there's an interesting shift in kind of the approach here. And the fact that, you know, the Trump administration was willing to make public that they had these discussions with Hamas is in and of itself an interesting dynamic, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, Trump is interested in results, it seems to me. And he was trying to get that American out before his State of the Union or his address to Congress. And of course, that failed, and then it withered away. Whether he is truly capable of getting that person out, because Hamas is not going to release him because Trump said so. They're going to release him based on the formula that they gave the Americans, which is about 250 people have to be released, including 100 people who are on life sentences. That was the price offered. Originally, it started at 500, and then they agreed, I think, to something somewhere in the middle. But whether it's 500 or 250 people, it doesn't matter. There is a price to be paid. But these people are in the hands of the Israelis. These Palestinians are in the hands of the Israelis. That means Trump and the Americans have to pressure the Israelis to release these Palestinians to get that American back. But right now, you know, this channel is no longer on. It's no longer operable. So there is a need now to either for the Americans to pressure the Israelis to fulfill their obligations under the agreement that was signed back in January, and to start in earnest the second phase negotiations, because that's the only way these hostages, these captives would be released. There is no military pressure that's going to get them out, and there's also no political pressure that's going to get them out. Trump's tried. I mean, all his cards. I mean, he threatened with with his tweets, and hell is going to break out. I don't know what's he going to do. Is he going to send the B-52s to bomb whatever remains in Gaza? I don't think so. Is he going to send the Marines and the airborne, the 82nd Airborne? No, I don't think so. I think at the end of the day, he has to negotiate, and he was trying to do that. But at the end of the day, the ones who have to deliver would be the Israelis. But he was not negotiating on the behalf of the Israelis, by the way. He just wanted to get that American out. So right now, they need to pressure Netanyahu and the team to start implementing the second phase.
And I just want to state for the record, too, that we watched for 15 months as a Democratic administration run by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris facilitated an Israeli genocide. And what we've witnessed in the 50 plus days that Donald Trump has been president is many partisan Democrats who never spoke one word against the policy that was implemented by Biden and Kamala Harris, now coming out and blaming Palestinians in the United States, blaming independent-minded voters, blaming opponents of the genocide for Donald Trump, when anyone with a brain in their head understands that if there's one party responsible for Donald Trump's election, it was the Democratic Party. But also, they seem to be much more outraged about Donald Trump's posts on Truth Social and his bombastic threats than they ever were about the actual facilitation of a genocide. Having said that, we do need to take seriously what Donald Trump says because he is the president of the United States. And you mentioned his threats that he was making there, but I just want to emphasize he's not just threatening Hamas. Trump, when he posted last week, said he also had a message for, quote, the people of Gaza. A beautiful future awaits, but not if you hold hostages. If you do, you are dead. That's a direct genocidal threat of collective punishment and mass murder against an entire population. So it's important that we recognize the real threat there that's being offered by Donald Trump. But your point is also a valid one. Does Trump intend to use the U.S. military aircraft that have been circling around Gaza recently in joint operations with the Israeli government? It's a question on the table. But for now, we are still in negotiations, so it's important to drill down here. And I wanted to ask you about this. Witkoff, for some time, had not really been answering directly on the White House position regarding Hamas and demilitarization or disarmament. And now he's really sharpened his position on that. And he's saying that the only path is that Hamas leaves Gaza and totally disarms. That's what he's saying now. It's what the Israelis have been demanding for a while. He's evolved to that position, and now he repeats it over and over, particularly in comments to the Israeli media. What is your understanding, Dr. Al-Arian, of what Hamas's view of that is? Because Hamas is on record saying we don't need to govern Gaza. We're fine with not being the governing power. They've said that they are fine with a committee organized under the auspices of the Palestinian Authority or of some sort of a national unity committee that would govern Gaza. But Hamas is not just the Qassam brigades. Hamas is not just a political party. There is a political movement. There is ideas behind it. So unpack some of this. Witkoff saying they have to leave and they have to disarm. And then Hamas saying we don't need to be the government, but also we're not going to disarm our forces until there's a Palestinian entity capable of defending our people and pursuing our right to self-determination and full statehood.
That's exactly right. What Witkoff is trying to do is to get through political pressure what Israel couldn't get through military onslaught for over 15 months. That's not going to happen. Hamas is not going to disarm because somehow the Americans think with these threats they will be they will be afraid, and then they will surrender. Hamas is not going to surrender. The other groups are not going to surrender, and the captives are not going to be released with such threats. There was an agreement. That agreement had many of the stipulations, many of the conditions that Hamas was trying to get into, and that's why it was fighting very hard for 15 months That's why it withstood this whole military pressure. Number one, total withdrawal from Gaza. Number two, total ceasefire, permanent ceasefire. Number three, the aid to the Palestinians, including the shelter. Number four, the rehabilitation and reconstruction. And number five, the exchange of prisoners. All these five conditions were part of the agreement. Netanyahu didn't like it, but he has to swallow it because Trump told him that he has to agree to it. The Americans need to step up. If they need a stable Middle East, they need to implement this agreement. Now, what happens to the day after? That is something that the Arabs addressed in their plan that was announced last week. And I think if you look closely to it, you will find that it really is a plan that tried to balance between the fact that you cannot dislodge Hamas from Gaza. At the same time, Hamas voluntarily has agreed not to be the arbiter or to be the ruler of Gaza, because they have offered this even before October 7th. They don't want to be to have this burden over them to be the ruler of Gaza. They have already agreed to an Egyptian proposal, which centers around the fact that there will be a technocratic committee, and they even agreed on the names. Most of these names are independent people or people associated with the Palestinian Authority, in which they will be in charge of the day after in Gaza. Hamas will take a back step. But to say that Hamas has to leave Gaza, why? Why would they have to leave Gaza? Gaza is their home. Gaza is where they have been born, where they have lived, and they are not going anywhere. And they are not going to lay down their arms unless they get their freedom. Laying your arms basically and leaving it at the mercy of the Israelis is just another form of surrender, another form of defeat, which they haven't been defeated on the battlefield. Why would they do that? They want Hamas to surrender. Well, it's not going to surrender. They will have to go and resume the fighting, but that's not going to be in their favor, because that's going also to engulf this whole region. Right now, I think if people have to look at the future, the best bet is to fulfill the agreement that has been signed, and also try to look seriously into this Arab plan that is trying to deal politically with all the situations. When Trump said that the Palestinians have to leave and it's going to be beautiful, what is he talking about? I mean, for Palestinians to leave their homeland and be scattered around the world, that is the future of Palestinians. The Palestinians would rather die in their own land than to have this pie in the sky type of thing. This is the product of imperialist, supremacist mentality that is totally rejected. It's not serious. Whether he is serious or not, remains to be seen. But that's not going to happen. Palestinians are going nowhere except on their own land.
What do you think is the most likely short-term development path right now in terms of these negotiations? I mean, do you see the Palestinian negotiators from Hamas and other resistance factions in the interim agreeing to some form of a limited extension of phase one in anticipation of a more robust negotiation on phase two? I mean, it does seem like Hamas's messaging right now is that they want to make some form of a deal. They're officially saying that what they want is phase two, but is it likely that we would see some limited deal in good faith where there's an exchange of captives in anticipation of further negotiation?
Hamas has a
or
dilemma.
are they going to hold the line and say, no, we will only negotiate phase two? You understand what I'm saying?
Right,
Do you sense they're going to be willing to agree to some step in the direction of that in the interim?
Hamas has a dilemma. And the dilemma is that if you negotiate a deal after months and months of negotiations, and in the middle of executing it, the other party comes, oh, I want to renegotiate this, something that you have already given some concessions for, that's what you gain this, it's give and take type of thing, and then you reach an agreement, and then the party, after they get what they want, they start to want to renegotiate the stuff that they didn't like. Once you go through that road, then it never ends. What would be the guarantor that if they agree to extension of 2 months, as Witkoff wants, that they're going to come back and says after they get another 10 or 15 or 20 of the hostages, that they come and change the terms. They haven't even fulfilled the first term. There hasn't been 600 trucks going to Gaza every day. Actually, they are cutting off electricity and fuel. There hasn't been 60,000 caravans and 200,000 tents delivered as it was stipulated and agreed upon in the first agreement. So what guarantees? And then obviously these guarantors including the US, they don't mean anything. They guaranteed that this will be implemented, and it was never implemented. So Hamas, as I said, will have to make a decision. I don't believe that they will make a decision to renegotiate this unless there are, ironclad guarantees. And I don't know what kind of guarantees people would give them, because these parties are not to be trusted. The Israelis are not to be trusted. They never fulfilled any obligation. Look what's happening in South Lebanon. That's what's happening in southern Syria. I mean, it's going all over the place. They have signed an agreement with the Lebanese, and they have not fulfilled their obligations. They're still occupying part of Lebanon. They are still killing them and assassinating them. Even in Gaza, even during this whole lull of since January 19th until today, almost 2 months, you still have, they killed almost 100 people, including half children and women. So what is it that the Hamas is supposed to do? All what they want to do is to strip Hamas from its leverage, is to strip Hamas from its strong cards, which is the hostages, in order to continue the war. And Hamas, the negotiators of Hamas and Hamas leadership are not stupid. They know what this is about. So my guess is that they will not agree to do this. If there is any kind of an extension, it would be just to resume the negotiations, but not to release hostages and captives, as the Americans and the Israelis have been insisting. It's probably just to complete the negotiations based on the same terms that have been signed, including obviously what hasn't been negotiated, which is the ratio of the remaining hostages to the Palestinians that have to be released. This is still up in the air. There has to be an agreement on the number, an agreement on the type of prisoners, and which ones will stay in the West Bank and which ones will have to leave Palestine. These are details that were supposed to be hashed out during the second phase negotiations.
We only have a short amount of time left, but I do want to make sure to get your analysis of the case of Mahmoud Khalil. I mentioned him at the beginning. Of course, Dropsite News readers are familiar with this story, but last Saturday night, Mahmoud Khalil, who is a recent graduate of Columbia University, who is a legal permanent resident of the United States, a green card holder, married to an American citizen. She's 8 months pregnant, snatched from his university housing, initially disappeared into the ICE system. Then we learn he's in Louisiana. His lawyers are fighting to try to prevent his deportation. The Trump administration has officially acknowledged that this is not a case of criminal activity, that they in fact are targeting him for his speech. They're saying that he was engaged in activities that align with Hamas. This is a very, very serious case because it calls into question multiple components of the U.S. Constitution, including the right to due process as well as free speech rights. But as someone yourself, Dr. Al-Arian, who has endured a political prosecution in the United States that is in a similar territory, the kinds of allegations that were being made against you and the defense that you offered was similar, that had to do with First Amendment protected activities. I want to get your take on this and the stakes involved with it as you see it.
It's incredible how American values, American Constitution, American cherished principles have been shredded by this administration and former other administrations. I mean, all because they're trying to save Zionism from its inevitable fate, which is it is an apartheid type regime. It's supremacist, racist ideology that is trying to create a system with two different set of laws that is involved in genocide and war of extermination and war crimes. Its leaders have been on the wanted list by the International Criminal Court, and yet they're trying to ignore all this and come after activists, particularly if they are vulnerable in their residency or immigration. But even this case is so incredible because the person has a green card. He's supposed to have the same protections as every other American citizen on American soil, and they just didn't care about any of that, and they arrested him and they want to deport him. He's married to an American citizen. This happened within the context of university protest, in which America has very rich history, in which universities are involved in these kind of struggles. That happened during Vietnam. It happened during the apartheid, South Africa. It happened during the civil rights movement. The churches and universities were at the forefront of this struggle. What the Trump administration is trying to do is just look the other way, go and try to make him an example so that they can scare the rest of the activists on campuses and throughout the United States. I don't think this is going to work. I think you have much richer tradition. I think it's going to enrage the people, and it's going to get the people all allied together and united in order to confront such fascist tactics. Just imagine someone who was on campus protesting a genocide, and you come and say, oh, he's pro-Hamas because he was, whether he's pro-Hamas or not, that even still, by the way, it's legal in the United States to be pro-Hamas. There is nothing in the more protected, I remember during my trial that the judge himself, he said, you could be pro whatever. What you cannot do is to aid them, and I believe also that the Supreme Court said that in different rulings, different cases, in which a person can even be a member. What they cannot do is that they can be a member of any group, but what they cannot be is to aid that group. So for him to say he's a member of Hamas, or even though there is zero evidence that is the case, it is just a slap on the face of this whole history. So I think what's going to happen, it's an attempt by them to please his donors, to please his benefactors, to please his Zionist friends. We've seen during the campaign, people have given hundreds of millions of dollars, like Bill Ackman and Miriam Edelson and others, in order to fulfill his obligation to them. He promised them that he's going to allow the annexation, or at least part of the West Bank. He has already fulfilled his previous obligations to recognize Jerusalem. This is the only reason he recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. It has nothing to do with American foreign policy. It just has to do with the tens of millions of dollars he received in campaign donations. That's what he was saying publicly. It's not, he wasn't even hiding it. The same thing happened with the Golan Heights, which is against international law, an occupied territory through force, in which there is several UN resolutions that have been that the US voted for, not once, not twice, but many times, such as UN Resolution 242 and 338 and many others, in which it recognizes the Golan Heights as being Syrian territory. Trump didn't care. He just went and said, okay, I allow Israel to annex the Golan Heights. I recognize that. So all these things have nothing to do with whatever is American policy in terms of the American strategic interest, or even American historical protections of constitutional principles or constitutional protections. All that is just going to be sold away because of this onslaught on American principles by the Zionist forces inside the United States.
Dr. Sami Al-Arian, the director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Zaim University, originally from Palestine. Thank you so much, Sami, for joining us here at Dropsite News.
Thank you, Jeremy, very much.
And that does it for this episode. Make sure to follow us on our podcast feed. You can search for Dropsite News wherever you get your podcasts. We also have a section on our webpage where you can find links to all your favorite podcast apps or directly to our RSS feed. Make sure to leave us a rating wherever you do listen to podcasts, because it helps other people to find us. If you want to support our work, you can subscribe at dropsitenews.com. You can also make a 501c3 tax-deductible donation to our work at our website. Just go to it and click on ways to give. Make sure to follow us on all social media platforms. Tell your friends, your foes about our work. Until next time, I'm Jeremy Scahill. On behalf of everybody at Dropsite News, thanks so much for joining us.